This is my Coffee Lake Illegear Raven, and when I purchased this back in early 2019, a 512GB NVMe solid state drive, I would have needed it at 580 ringgit. Something I just couldn't afford, and thus I just stuck with a 256GB SATA M.2 solid state drive. Currently I store my video games on this external Western Digital My Passport drive, which is a hard drive, and that means that boot times of the games are slow. And so when I want to game, I'm not very well encouraged to game because of just how slow the games take to load. So when I realized that NVMe SSDs of relatively large capacities are really affordable nowadays, this isn't anything impressive. I mean, PCIe Gen 4 is now the latest and greatest, but this laptop is PCIe Gen 3 only, so this works well for me. I picked this up for only 120 ringgit. So we're going to install this NVMe drive into my Illegear Raven, and we're going to reinstall Windows, and we're then going to move my games from the My Passport drive over to this NVMe drive, and I want to do a comparison of game boot times. Firstly, I need to transfer some files from the SSD to the hard drive, as even though this laptop has two M.2 slots, which means I could actually run my old SSD and my new SSD concurrently, I am not going to do that. I'm going to just remove the old SSD and put in a new one. And secondly, I actually don't have the screw to allow me to populate the second M.2 NVMe bay. So while I can use two drives concurrently, theoretically, in practice, I cannot. And sadly, I don't have one of those M.2 to USB adapters. Using that, considering my limitation of only being able to have one NVMe drive inside my laptop a given time, would actually be faster, as transferring from SSD to SSD is faster than right now, which is what I'm doing, is SSD to hard drive and a hard drive back to SSD. As you can see, a hard drive here is currently maxing out at about 60 megabytes per second, and this is most definitely a limitation of the Western Digital My Passport drive, as you can see, than the SSD inside my laptop currently. And before I actually go ahead and do the swapping of the SSDs, let's actually do some speed tests, because this is a more realistic scenario instead of me upgrading the SSD and then trying to boot the game up from the external hard drive. It's not a fair representation of its current state, which is the SATA SSD booting up from external hard drive. I mean, the differences between the two aforementioned scenarios should be very negligible, but nonetheless, this is more realistic. Let's go. Starting out with Steam and BeamNG drive. Let's launch game and then start. Okay, so that was about 2.5 minutes. Let's try something from Epic Games, Fall Guys. So about 2 minutes. Alright, let's go ahead and shut this down and upgrade the SSD. So upgrading the SSD for this laptop is actually unusually fast, and that's because for me, I have the bottom panel already unscrewed allows me to have quick access to the battery connector. I don't leave my battery plugged in all the time. So here is the old SSD. It's a Micron 1100 SATA 6 gigabits per second. And this is our new SSD. This is a silicon powered 512GB M.2 2280, which is the size, PCIe Gen 3x4. This is the P34A60 model. You can use brute force. Okay. Slide the SSD out of the cardboard packaging. There is instructions up here, which I'm not sure you'll be able to see. M.2 SSDs are so quick to install compared to 2.5-inch solid-state drives. Between SATA and NVMe, in terms of the fingers, you can see that there's an extra key, extra notch for the SATA NVMe SSD. Using a non-magnetic screwdriver definitely slows down my process. Okay, that's installed. Let's go ahead and close the panel. I will not be cloning the drive because I don't actually want all my garbage from my old drive. Let's go ahead and boot this thing up. It should go straight into the BIOS because there is no operating system. I have a Windows 10 disk image which I'll just quickly install, which will be much quicker than for me to install the Windows the way that normally people do with the USB key and whatnot. So yeah, in the BIOS, it has detected M.2 PCIe SSD. This is the process. This is it actually installing Windows for me. So in just 48 seconds, it restored a 6GB disk image in 50 seconds. And there we go, 512 gig drive. And yes, I purposely am going to have my data on a separate volume just so that if Windows gets corrupted, my files are not at jeopardy. So let's go ahead and get some speed tests going. And this is the CrystalDiskMark reply. And what it reminded me of is my first SSD was a Pioneer APS SL2, which I made a video on many years ago. Now back then, there was a chip shortage. And so a 120 gig drive was 240 ringgit. And this was the results I got back then. So yeah, twice the price, 1/4 the capacity, 5 times slower. Now let's try BeamNG drive, which is on the NVMe SSD. 35 seconds. I don't remember what the old one is, but that's definitely quicker. Let's now move on to Fall Guys. I think it's 4 times faster. So not exactly instantaneous, but that's my expectations being too high. So anyway, I've successfully upgraded my laptop from a SATA drive with my game data on a hard disk drive to a larger capacity NVMe drive, which allows me to have my games on that NVMe drive